Imagine a room where a single sentence shifts the entire axis of power, leaving an opponent speechless. This isn't just political theater, it's a masterclass in human dynamics. A psychological chess match where every gesture, every pause, every subtle shift of weight carries meaning. What happens when raw aggression meets cultivated restraint? When noise confronts profound silence? The answer unfolds not in a dramatic shout, but in a quiet statement that echoes long after the microphones are turned off. The mood in the Washington press hall was a taut wire, humming with the static of 100 silent predictions. You could feel it in the air, that peculiar density that precedes storms, both meteorological and metaphorical. Sunlight cut through the high windows in sharp blades, illuminating swirling dust motes that danced like miniature spectators. Journalists weren't just waiting, they were bracing. Their bodies leaned forward unconsciously, muscles tense, as if physically preparing for impact. Cameras pointed like unblinking eyes, their lenses cold and calculating, while microphones stretched forward like antennae, searching for a signal in the emotional fog. The room smelled of old coffee, nervous sweat, and the faint ozone scent of electronic equipment pushed to its limits. Everyone understood the unspoken rules of this particular arena. When he took the stage, the ground could turn to quicksand in a heartbeat. Reality had a way of bending around his presence, facts becoming malleable, attention becoming a weapon to be wielded rather than a resource to be shared. Seasoned correspondents exchanged knowing glances, the kind shared by veterans who've survived the same battlefield multiple times. Young interns clutched their recorders with white-knuckled intensity, simultaneously thrilled and terrified to witness history's rough draft being composed in real time. He entered not with ceremony, but with assertion. The door swung open, and he filled the space immediately, his energy preceding him like a shock wave. He leaned into the polished wooden podium as if claiming territory, his hands gripping its edges with proprietary confidence. His gaze, sharp, assessing, perpetually calculating, scanned the crowd like a radar until it locked onto a specific target. There was a predator's focus in that look, the kind that instinctively finds weakness and prepares to exploit it. The jab came fast and low, delivered not with shouting but with a conversational sharpness that made it more devastating. 8 years of elegant lectures, he began, pausing just long enough to let the words hang. But the results were a ghost town. The metaphor was deliberate, evocative, visual, designed to stick. The words landed with a dull thud in the suddenly still room. For a fraction of a second, there was perfect silence. Then a ripple of sharp inhalations cut through the space like wind through grass. Eyebrows arched in surprise or disapproval. Whispers broke out like small cracks spreading across glass. First one, then 3, then a dozen. A few smirks appeared at the edges of the crowd, journalists who had anticipated this familiar spectacle and were now receiving their expected drama. But Truve, the deeper weight unfortunately seated off to the side, a guest at what was meant to be a bipartisan event about infrastructure or education, the specifics already fading into irrelevance. His posture was a study in stillness, a calm eddy in what was becoming a rushing stream of confrontation. Where others fidgeted, he remained motionless. Where others reacted, he observed. He was listening, not just to the words but to the spaces between them, to the rhythm of the attack, to the emotional landscape being painted in broad, aggressive strokes. The man at the microphone, this was a prime-time opportunity, another chapter in an ongoing story of domination and disruption. For the man in the chair, it was becoming something else entirely. A test of principle, a moment of decision, a crossroads where multiple paths diverged. He could see them clearly. The path of retaliation, the path of withdrawal, the path of dignified refutation. His choice would define not just this moment, but how both men would be remembered in this particular historical fragment. A journalist from St. Louis, her press pass slightly crooked, muttered into her recorder, "Direct hit launched. Tone is confrontational, personal." Her words were barely audible but captured the prevailing sentiment. Another correspondent, older with glasses perched on his nose, scribbled "confrontation" in bold capital letters across his notepad, underlining it twice for emphasis. The air itself seemed to grow dense, charged with a single unspoken question that hovered above everyone like a caption. Would the calm man break his silence? Would he step into the arena on the aggressor's terms? The speaker's voice climbed a register, filling the space not just with sound, but with presence. "The press adored his poetry," he continued, gesturing vaguely toward the seated figure without looking at him directly. "But the nation needed prose. We're stronger now because we face reality without the decorative language." His hand hit the wooden podium for punctuation, a sharp crack that made several people jump. Some reporters nodded, but not in agreement. Theirs was the nod of recognition, of familiarity with a script they all knew by heart. They'd seen this act before, knew its beats and rhythms, could anticipate where the crescendo would come. Across the room, the seated man performed the smallest of motions. He adjusted his cuff. A barely perceptible tug at the white fabric emerging from his suit jacket sleeve. In an ordinary setting, it would have been meaningless, a habitual fidget, a minor adjustment. But in that hyper-focused arena, where every eye was either on the aggressor or watching for the target's reaction, it became a signal. A CNN camera operator noticed first, his camera whirring as it zoomed in silently. The lens captured details. The composed line of his lips, neither smiling nor frowning. The steadiness of his gaze. The complete absence of tension in his shoulders. He looked not angry, but prepared. Not reactive, but responsive. Like a chess grandmaster who had seen this particular opening gambit many games ago and already knew several moves ahead. "If he speaks now," a veteran correspondent whispered to her colleague, her hand partially covering her mouth, "it will define everything, not just today, but the whole narrative." Her colleague nodded grimly, pen poised above his notebook, ready to capture what might come next. The crowd understood the dynamic being established, even if they couldn't articulate it. One man thrived on turning the spotlight into a scalpel, using attention as a surgical instrument to dissect opponents. The other seemed to exist in a different relationship with visibility, not seeking it, not fleeing it, but holding it with a kind of respectful distance. He sat in what was becoming a pool of quiet so deep it was becoming audible, a silence that had weight and texture, that occupied space rather than merely filling an absence. The contrast between the two approaches was becoming a physical thing in the room, almost tactile. It was fire against granite, heat against coolness, percussion against sustain. A pointed finger shot out from the podium, aiming across the space. "There's the orator," the speaker said, the word delivered with layered sarcasm. "All vision, no foundation. All blueprint, no building. People are exhausted by it." The accusation hung in the air, heavier this time because it was more specific, more targeted. All eyes swiveled from the accuser to the accused, creating an almost comical wave of motion through the crowd. A Fox correspondent leaned toward his neighbor, muttering, "Will he swallow it? Or will he bite back?" He moved. not with a start, but with intention. The movement began from his center, a slight forward lean of the torso, a deliberate folding of hands in his lap. Then his eyes rose and met the speaker's for a fleeting second. Not a glare, not a challenge, but a glance that nonetheless carried volumes. It was the look of acknowledgement, not of agreement, but of recognition. I see you. I hear you. I am not afraid of you. The speaker grinned, sensing control, believing he had provoked the reaction he wanted. "See?" he announced to the room, as if presenting evidence. "Silence! No defense, no fight. When confronted with reality, the poetry dries up." But those in the room who understood rhythm, not just of speech, but of human interaction, knew better. They recognized that this particular silence wasn't empty. It was gathering mass. It was the silence of a drawn breath before speech, not the silence of retreat. This understanding became physical when he pushed back his chair. The sound was ordinary, the scrape of wood on polished floor, but in that loaded atmosphere it might as well have been a thunderclap. He rose. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a fluidity that suggested this action was inevitable, preordained, the next logical note in a composition. The simple act of standing, unfolding to his full height, squaring his shoulders, recalibrated the energy in the chamber. It was like the pressure drop before a storm, that strange, quiet moment when leaves turn their backs to the wind. The room leaned in as one organism, a collective intake of breath held simultaneously by hundreds of people. He approached the microphone with a pace that belonged to him alone, unhurried and definitive, each step measured. He wasn't walking toward confrontation, he was walking toward a moment that required his presence. When he reached the podium, he performed a simple adjustment of the microphone stand, lowering it slightly. The metallic squeak pierced the quiet with almost painful clarity. Then he paused. Not a hesitant pause, but a deliberate one. That pause stretched, bending time, pulling every ounce of attention in the room toward him like gravity. Reporters glanced at each other, their pens trembling slightly above paper. The speaker, still at his own microphone, crossed his arms. The smirk on his face remained, but it was beginning to look painted on, a mask rather than a genuine expression. Physicist. He scanned the room, not quickly, not nervously, but with a slow sweep that seemed to acknowledge each section individually. He was letting the collective anticipation build until it was almost painful, until the room felt like a single held breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, steady river flowing through a landscape of noise. "This was never about me," he began, the words simple, clear, unadorned. "It's about the country we all must steward." That wasn't the viral line, not yet, but it was the first move in what was becoming a masterful, rhetorical game. It was a reframing, a gentle but firm redirecting of the conversation's center of gravity from personality to principle. The tone was set, elevated, inclusive, focused on something larger than the two men in the room. A chuckle came from the other podium, dry, dismissive. "And here it comes," the speaker said, shaking his head slightly. "More lofty ideals. People need paychecks, not philosophy. They need solutions, not seminars." Murmurs of agreement surfaced from certain sections of the room, supporters who found the pragmatic framing compelling. He didn't flinch at the interruption. He seemed to absorb it without resistance, like deep water absorbing a stone's impact. He shifted his weight slightly, one hand coming to rest lightly on the wooden surface before him. "Results grow from clarity," he responded, his voice maintaining its even cadence. "Power without a true north is just sound and fury." The line landed not with a shout, but with the precision of a surgeon's blade, clean, sharp, effective. Heads turned almost involuntarily to gauge the reaction from the other podium. The grin across the room flickered, just for an instant, like a light bulb momentarily losing power before steadying. "Clarity?" the speaker retorted, leaning forward as if to physically press his point. "We have it. Markets rising, jobs returning, pride restored. That's clarity." The response was predictable, a return to tangible metrics, to what could be counted and measured. The calm man tilted his head slightly, not a nod, not a shake, but that particular tilt of a professor considering a student's passionate but incomplete answer. "Pride isn't a statistic," he said, and the room seemed to lean closer to catch each word. "It's not a data point on a quarterly report. Pride is measured in how we lift each other up, in how we see each other's humanity before we see our differences." The energy in the chamber shifted palpably, like a ship changing course against a current. This was no longer just an exchange, it was becoming a chess match in real time, with pieces moving on a board visible only to those who understood the game being played. What followed was a series of moves and counter-moves, aggressive advances met with poised, principled defenses. "You left us fractured!" came the accusation from across the room. The response came calmly. "Division doesn't begin with citizens. It starts at the top, with language that separates rather than unites." Another thrust. "We rebuilt strength!" The parry. "Strength without compassion is just a harder form of weakness. A wall without a gate. A fist without an open hand." Sending in the room another notch. A reporter near the front, live streaming on his phone, whispered to his unseen audience, "He's not raising his voice, but every sentence is a counterweight. Every response is rebalancing the scale." Indeed, something fundamental was shifting in the room's emotional architecture. The speaker's frustration, previously concealed beneath bravado, began to bleed through the performance. His gestures, once controlled for maximum effect, turned jagged, less precise. His volume spiked at unpredictable moments, but the angrier he became, the more physically agitated, the more centered his counterpart seemed to grow. It was a live portrait of contrast being painted before hundreds of witnesses. Turbulence versus stillness, reaction versus response. Without anyone announcing it, without any formal declaration, the narrative center of gravity was moving. The reporter's pens and keyboards, which had initially chased the loudest voice in the room, now followed the calm one. The headline was being rewritten before their eyes, the story transforming from "aggressor attacks" to "dignified response redirects conversation." He was walking the room, and through cameras the world, toward a single defining moment that everyone could feel approaching but couldn't yet name. The speaker sensed this slippage, this gradual erosion of his narrative control. "You had your turn," he interjected, louder now, almost shouting. "History remembers the outcome. The record is written." It was a desperate move, an appeal to final judgment, to some imagined court of historical opinion that had already rendered its verdict. Zelt broke eye contact with the room, but his response wasn't directed at the speaker. It was offered to the space between them, to the idea itself. "History remembers something else too," he said, and his voice took on a different quality, softer but carrying further. "Failure isn't stumbling. We all stumble. Failure is ceasing to care about who stumbles with you. It's building a ladder and then pulling it up behind you." A collective breath was held throughout the chamber. This wasn't the knockout line, not yet, but it was the warning shot, the setup. The knockout line was coming. You could feel it building in the charged air, like humidity before rainfall. But truly memorable moments need tension to reach its absolute peak before release. The speaker, fighting with everything he had to reclaim the stage, gripped his podium with both hands, his knuckles whitening. His voice became a blade, sharpened by desperation. "Don't be fooled by the pretty words," he barked, the command echoing. "He handed out beautiful sentences while the world laughed at our back. He gave you rhetoric. I give you revival." The attack was a full barrage now, no longer targeted jabs, but artillery fire designed to bury and humiliate. He turned his body slightly, addressing the cameras directly, speaking past the room to the millions at home. He wasn't just ineffective, he was a mistake the country is still correcting. The room gasped, an actual audible gasp that swept through like a wave. Pens clattered to desks, dropped by startled hands. This was a new line, drawn not in sand but in acid, crossing some unspoken boundary of political decorum that even in this era felt shockingly breached. He stood a few feet away, unmoved. His expression didn't change. No flinch, no widening of eyes, no tightening of jaw. If anything, his features softened slightly, as if witnessing a tragedy rather than experiencing an attack. That profound stillness, that refusal to mirror the aggression, seemed to agitate his opponent more than any retort possibly could. "You think this is a joke?" the speaker demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Cool detachment doesn't secure borders, it doesn't fill wallets, it doesn't put food on tables." The press corps reacted with a low rumble, not of approval or disapproval, but of sheer astonishment at the spectacle unfolding. This was no longer political theater, it was becoming something closer to public evisceration. And yet, through it all, the silent man remained exactly that. Silent. Not passively, not weakly, but with a silence that was actively listening, actively processing, actively waiting. And the perfect opening for his response was being handed to him with each escalating outburst. The final, most personal insult seemed to hang in the air long after it was spoken, its toxic particles slowly settling over everything. He wasn't just ineffective, he was the greatest misstep of a generation. The gasp this time was universal, a sharp intake that left the room momentarily oxygen-deprived. Even the most hardened journalists, who had covered wars and scandals and every variety of human failing, froze. For a second, there was perfect silence, the kind of silence that has texture and weight. The speaker grinned, expecting what? A flinch? A furious rebuttal? A loss of composure that would justify his own escalation? He received neither. Instead, something far more devastating to his position occurred. The calm man stepped forward. Not aggressively, not defensively, but simply. The sound of his shoes on the polished floor, a soft, deliberate tap, 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 was stark in the new silence. He reached the podium that had been offered to him earlier, placed a hand on its surface, not with force, but with connection, and looked out. Not at his opponent immediately, but at the room, at the people. Then, finally, his eyes found the speaker's. He held that stare, not challenging, not angry, but steady, until the smirk across the room began to dissolve into something else. Uncertainty, then confusion, then dawning recognition that the script had been flipped. The silence he cultivated wasn't passive. It was a force. It was the silence of a judge waiting for the courtroom to settle before delivering a verdict. He finally spoke, his voice clear and carrying without strain. "I believed we gathered today for a purpose beyond this." 8 words. Simple. Clean. The room exhaled as one, a collective release of tension that had become almost unbearable. The reframe was instantaneous and complete, from personal confrontation back to shared purpose, from two men fighting to representatives discussing something larger than themselves. Scoffed, grasping for his familiar tools. "The unity sermon," he said, the words dripping with practiced cynicism. "Right on schedule, always the same tune." He didn't react to the taunt, not with words, not with expression. He simply continued, as if the interruption were a distant echo. "Unity isn't a sermon," he clarified, his tone patient, explanatory. "It's a prerequisite. Without it, every step forward is a stumble. Every effort fragments. Every gain is temporary." The murmurs returned, but differently now, thoughtful rather than reactive. The chess match had resumed, but the trajectory was now unmistakable. With each calm, weighted reply, the loud insults from across the room began to sound smaller, pettier, reactive rather than strategic. A journalist near the aisle whispered to her neighbor, "He's not fighting him, he's framing him. He's changing what the fight is about." The peak was near. Everyone could feel it, that convergence point where pressure finds its release. The cameras pushed in tight, lenses focusing until individual pores were visible. Every reporter was literally on the edge of their seat, pens hovering above paper, fingers poised above keyboards. The speaker, sensing this culmination, tried one last time with his original weapon, personal accusation. "Just admit it," he demanded, pointing directly now. "You failed. Look at the American people and admit it." He didn't look. Instead, he looked at the cameras, really looked at them, as if seeing through the lenses to the people on the other side. Then his gaze swept the room, making contact with individual faces, seeing the journalists as human beings rather than instruments of coverage. "When I look out," he began, and his voice changed subtly, becoming more intimate, more connected. "I don't see failure. I see resilience. I see determination. I see communities that outlast any leader's term, any policy's lifespan, any headline's cycle." The words connected beyond the chamber walls. You could feel them landing in living rooms and kitchens across the country. The speaker laughed bitterly, a short, sharp sound. "More polished words, more elegant emptiness. People are sick of polish. They want truth." He met the gaze then, finally, and his tone became firmer, though not louder. "Substance doesn't require a shout," he said, each word distinct. "Substance endures after the shouting stops. Truth doesn't need decoration. It stands on its own." Then came the moment. That crystalline point of absolute quiet that sometimes arrives in the midst of chaos. The speaker had shouted himself into a void, expended his emotional ammunition. The room was a vacuum, waiting to be filled with meaning rather than noise. He stood straight, one hand resting lightly on the podium, the other at his side. He took one breath, a visible, deliberate inhalation, and delivered the line that would become the story, the headline, the takeaway, the memory. "Leadership," he said, and the word hung alone for a heartbeat, "isn't validated by the rivals you diminish." Pause. The room leaned forward. "It's measured by the citizens you empower." But that followed was total, not empty but full, saturated with meaning. It was the silence of a conclusion being accepted, of an argument reaching its natural end, of a truth being recognized. The speaker opened his mouth, formed a word, but no sound emerged. His hands gripped his own podium, knuckles white against the dark wood. A reporter from Indianapolis, known for her cynicism, simply mouthed to herself, "That's the headline." And she was right. It was simple enough to remember, impossible to reframe without sounding petty, and carried the moral weight of the entire exchange in 17 words. He didn't linger on the moment. He didn't smirk or show satisfaction. He turned his gaze back to the room, his expression softening back to its natural state. "That's why I came today," he continued, seamlessly pivoting, "to discuss our future. Because the next generation won't judge us by the arguments we won or the insults we crafted. They'll judge us by the foundation we left, by whether we built something that lifts them higher." The transition was masterful, from confrontation to construction, from personal defense to collective responsibility. The reporter's focus was now entirely his. Their questions, when they began again, would follow his lead, explore his framing. The speaker stepped back from his podium, muttering something that was drowned by the sudden flurry of typing and scribbling that erupted around him. The cameras, with their unblinking objectivity, captured his deflated posture, shoulders slightly slumped, energy dissipated, an image that would spread through news cycles almost as fast as the viral sentence itself. PLC. In the back of the room, a young journalist on her first major assignment whispered to herself, not for her recorder but for her own understanding, "That's composure. That's authority. That's how you hold space without grabbing it." Her words captured what everyone had witnessed but might struggle to articulate. And outside that room, in the strange alchemy of modern media, the line was already traveling, through texts, tweets, conversations, a perfect vessel carrying a deeper debate about character, power, and what we truly mean when we use the word strength. Hardness. He adjusted the microphone slightly, a practical gesture that brought the moment back to human scale. His voice returned to a conversational plane, warm but not casual. "We can debate policies endlessly," he acknowledged. "We will disagree on methods, on priorities, on solutions. That's democracy. That's healthy. But true service, the kind that lasts beyond elections and news cycles, is judged by a single question. Did you leave people more capable than you found them? Did you add to their strength, their dignity, their sense of possibility?" He spoke to the cameras, yes, but through them to the principle itself, speaking past the immediate moment to something timeless. The speaker exhaled sharply, the sound picked up by his still live microphone. "Speeches," he muttered, the word trailing off. But it was a ghost of a response, an echo without substance. It had no power here anymore. The linguistic battlefield had been decisively claimed by a different kind of language altogether. The room was a study in shifted reality. The event's stated topic, whatever bipartisan issue had ostensibly gathered them, was forgotten, receding like a distant shoreline. The insults, the accusations, the personal attacks were now just context, the chaotic raw material from which something clearer had been refined. The only thing that mattered, the only thing anyone would remember in substance, was that one crystallizing idea about the nature of true leadership. Subjected more effectively than any lecture could, a fundamental truth about human communication. In a battle of noise versus signal, volume versus meaning, aggression versus principle, a single sentence delivered with conviction, clarity, and impeccable timing can change the entire resonance of a conversation. It can redirect rivers of attention. It can reframe conflicts. It can transform spectators into witnesses of something more important than conflict. For winds of thought, this moment stands as a permanent lesson in the power of restrained, purposeful speech. It demonstrates that the most powerful voice in a room isn't necessarily the loudest, but the one that speaks to the deepest parts of our shared understanding. It reminds us that language at its best doesn't just describe reality, it creates new possibilities within it. When we choose words that elevate rather than diminish, that connect rather than divide, that build rather than destroy, we participate in that same alchemical transformation. This breakdown of rhetorical power reveals the architecture behind moments that linger in cultural memory. It shows how emotional intelligence, strategic silence, and moral clarity can combine to create responses that resonate across divides. The principles on display here, listening before speaking, responding rather than reacting, framing personal attacks as opportunities to discuss larger principles, are applicable far beyond political stages. They work in boardrooms and classrooms, in family conversations and community meetings, anywhere human beings attempt to navigate conflict and find common ground. If you found this exploration compelling, if you believe in the power of words to shape our world for the better, please like this video. Your engagement helps us continue this important work of analyzing the moments that define us. And subscribe to Winds of Thought. Click that notification bell for more deep dives into the speeches, conversations, and rhetorical moments that don't just capture headlines, but actually change the trajectory of how we think, how we communicate, and ultimately, how we build a world that reflects our highest principles rather than our lowest impulses. The next time you face noise, remember, the most powerful response might not be a louder noise, but a different kind of signal altogether.